Close your eyes and let yourself drift back, back through the centuries, back beyond the pyramids, beyond the pharaohs, to a time when the world was still being born from the waters of chaos. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the beginning, there was only none, an endless, dark ocean of nothingness. From these primordial waters, a mound of earth slowly emerged, the very first land, like an island rising from the sea. And upon this mound stood Atum, the first god, alone in the universe. From his own being, he created Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. And so the world began to take shape, breath by breath, moment by moment. But this wasn't just mythology. The Egyptians understood something profound about their land. Every single year, the Nile River would flood, covering the valley in water. And when those waters receded, they left behind rich, dark soil, and new mounds of earth would appear, just like in their creation story. They watched their world be reborn each year, and their myths reflected what they saw with their own eyes. Around 7,000 years ago, long before the first pyramid was ever dreamed of, people began to settle along the banks of this remarkable river. They came from the drying Sahara, as the climate changed and the grasslands turned to sand. The Nile was a ribbon of life cutting through an ocean of desert, and these early people discovered something extraordinary. The river flooded with perfect regularity every summer, as if the gods themselves had set a calendar. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that thousands of miles away to the south, monsoon rains were falling on the highlands of Ethiopia. These rains fed the Blue Nile and the Atbara River, and like clockwork, every June, the swollen rivers would begin their journey north, arriving in Egypt by midsummer. The ancient Egyptians called this annual miracle Akhet, the inundation, and they built their entire civilization around it. In these early days, in the villages along the river, there were no pharaohs yet, no golden treasures, just small communities of farmers who learned to work with the flood. They discovered that if they built simple mud walls, they could trap the water in basins, allowing it to soak deeply into the earth. When the floods receded, the wet soil was perfect for planting barley and emmer wheat. And remarkably, the flood waters carried something even more precious than water itself: rich silt from the heart of Africa, nutrients that made the Egyptian soil some of the most fertile on earth. These early Egyptians left us clues about their lives. In burial sites dating back over 5,000 years, archaeologists have found the bodies of people carefully laid to rest in the fetal position, facing west toward the setting sun, surrounded by pottery, tools, and food for a journey they believed would come after death. Even then, before kings or temples, they already held a deep belief in an afterlife. The villages grew. People began to specialize. Some became potters, crafting vessels that still survive today, decorated with images of the Nile, boats, and dancing figures. Others became hunters, fishermen, weavers. And slowly, gradually, these villages began to unite. In the north, in the lush delta where the Nile split into many branches before reaching the Mediterranean Sea, communities joined together into a kingdom. They wore the red crown. In the south, along the narrow valley where the river flowed between limestone cliffs, another kingdom formed. They wore the white crown. For centuries, these two kingdoms existed side by side, two Egypts, separate and distinct. The Delta people fished in the marshy wetlands and grew papyrus. The valley people farmed the narrow strips of green beside the river. Each had their own gods, their own rulers, their own traditions. And then, around 5,000 years ago, everything changed. A king arose, a warrior whose name echoes down through history, though we're still not entirely certain of all the details. The Egyptians called him Nama, or perhaps Mens. He may have been one man, or the name may represent several rulers whose achievements blended into legend. What we do know is this: the two lands were united. Upper and Lower Egypt became one kingdom, and the king who achieved this wore both crowns, the red crown of the delta and the white crown of the valley, combined into the double crown called the Pshent. In the dry sands near the ancient city of Nekhen, archaeologists discovered a slate palette, a ceremonial object used for grinding cosmetics. On one side, it shows King Nama wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, striking down an enemy. On the other side, he wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, standing victorious over the bodies of his foes. This simple object, carved over 5,000 years ago, may commemorate the very moment Egypt became one land, one people, united under one king. And with this unification, something extraordinary began. A civilization that would last for 3,000 years, longer than the distance between us and the birth of Christ. A civilization that would build monuments that still stand today, was taking its first breath. Let yourself drift with the current of the Nile, flowing north through the United Kingdom, as we continue our journey through time. The United Kingdom was still young, still finding its way, when a pharaoh named Dosa ascended to the throne. This was the third dynasty, around 4,600 years ago, and Egypt was prosperous. The Nile continued its eternal rhythm, flooding and receding, feeding the people, and the kingdom was at peace. Dosa had a vision. The kings before him had been buried under rectangular mud brick structures called mastabas, low, flat-topped tombs that dotted the desert's edge. But Dosa wanted something more, something that would touch the sky itself. And he had at his side a genius, a man whose name would echo through history, Imhotep. Imhotep was many things: a high priest, a physician, an architect, a scribe. He was so revered that, centuries after his death, the Egyptians would worship him as a god of wisdom and medicine. And it was Imhotep who conceived of something revolutionary. What if they stacked mastabas on top of each other, each one smaller than the last, creating a stairway to heaven? At Saqqara, in the desert west of the ancient capital of Memphis, they began to build. The step pyramid rose in 6 massive tiers, reaching 200 feet into the sky, the tallest structure in the world at that time. But here's something remarkable: it wasn't just a tomb. Imhotep designed an entire complex around it, covering 37 acres, surrounded by a limestone wall over 30 feet high. There were courtyards, temples, shrines, and thousands of false doors and dummy buildings, some carved from solid stone to look like wooden reed structures, preserving in eternal stone the architectural styles of that age. And the most extraordinary part: the entire complex was built from limestone blocks, not mud brick. This was the first large-scale stone structure in human history. Imhotep had transformed architecture itself, and the Egyptians were just beginning. The kings who followed saw what was possible. They experimented, they refined, they dreamed bigger. A pharaoh named Sneferu, founder of the 4th dynasty, built not 1, not 2, but 3 pyramids. The first, at Atum, began as a step pyramid but was modified into a true pyramid and partially collapsed. The second, the bent pyramid at Dasha, started at one angle, but the builders had to change the slope partway up when they realized the structure was unstable, giving it its distinctive bent appearance. But the third was perfect. The red pyramid, also at Dasha, rose at a gentle angle, its smooth limestone faces gleaming in the sun. It was the first successful true pyramid, and it paved the way for the greatest achievement of all. Sneferu's son, Khufu, ascended to the throne around 2580 BCE, and Khufu dreamed of something unprecedented, a pyramid so massive, so perfect, that it would dwarf everything that had come before. On the Giza Plateau, where the desert met the edge of cultivation, they began to build. For over 20 years, the work continued. Imagine the organization required. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, was told that 100,000 men worked on the Great Pyramid. Modern archaeologists believe the number was smaller, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 workers. But still, imagine coordinating that many people, all working toward a single purpose. Here's something that might surprise you. These weren't slaves. The workers were paid laborers, Egyptian citizens who worked in shifts, especially during the flood season when their fields were underwater and they couldn't farm. Archaeologists have discovered the workers' village near the pyramids and found bakeries that could produce thousands of loaves of bread, and evidence of medical care, healed broken bones, suggesting that injured workers were treated and cared for. Graffiti left by the workers shows they organized themselves into crews with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, taking pride in their work. They quarried limestone blocks locally, each weighing an average of 2.5 tons. But for the inner chambers, they needed something stronger, granite. And so they traveled 500 miles south to Aswan, where they cut massive granite blocks, some weighing 80 tons, and floated them down the Nile on barges. Imagine the engineering, the careful calculations, the ropes and wooden sledges, the thousands of hands working in perfect coordination. The pyramid rose, layer by layer, course by course. They used ramps, probably a combination of straight ramps and spiral ramps wrapping around the structure. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps were extended, raised, modified. It was like watching a mountain being born from the desert itself. When it was finished, the Great Pyramid stood 481 feet tall, taller than a 40-story building. It contained approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. And here's something extraordinary. The base is almost perfectly level, with a maximum difference in height of just half an inch across its 755-foot length. The four sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that deviates by less than 1/10 of a degree. Without compasses, without modern surveying equipment, using only the stars and the sun and their remarkable understanding of mathematics, they achieved a precision that still amazes engineers today. The pyramid was originally covered in smooth, white Tura limestone casing stones, polished to a brilliant shine. The apex may have been capped in gold or electrum, a mixture of gold and silver. When the sun rose over the desert, the pyramid would have gleamed like a beacon, visible for miles in every direction. Sadly, most of these casing stones were stripped away centuries later to build medieval Cairo, but a few remain near the top of Khafra's pyramid, giving us a glimpse of how magnificent they once were. Inside the Great Pyramid, hidden within the stone, are chambers and passageways. The king's chamber, made of red granite, contains an empty sarcophagus. Above it, 5 relieving chambers distribute the weight of the stone above, protecting the burial chamber from collapse, a testament to the builder's understanding of structural engineering. The shafts that extend from the chambers toward the outside of the pyramid align with certain stars, Orion and Sirius, stars that the Egyptians associated with the afterlife and the gods Osiris and Isis. Khufu's son, Khafra, built the second pyramid at Giza, slightly smaller but appearing taller because it sits on higher ground. And beside it, carved from a massive outcrop of limestone, he created the Great Sphinx, a lion's body with a human head, gazing eternally eastward toward the rising sun. For 4,500 years, it has kept its silent watch. The third pyramid at Giza belongs to Menkaure, Khafra's successor. Smaller than the others, but no less remarkable in its construction and purpose. This was the age when Egypt believed its kings were living gods, divine beings who would ascend to the heavens upon death and take their place among the stars. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were resurrection machines, launching pads for the soul, stairways connecting earth to sky, ensuring that the divine king could complete his eternal journey. But even as these monuments rose toward forever, the kingdom itself was changing, evolving, moving toward challenges and transformations that no pyramid could prevent. Let the starlight that guided the pyramid builders guide you now, as we drift forward through the centuries. The pyramids stood complete, monuments to divine kingship and eternal order. But nothing in this world, not even Egypt, remains unchanged forever. As the Old Kingdom continued through its 5th and 6th dynasties, something subtle began to shift. The pharaohs were still building pyramids, but they were smaller now, less grand. The resources that had flowed to the king were spreading outward, to nobles and provincial governors who were growing wealthy and powerful in their own right. These governors, called nomarchs, ruled the regions called nomes, and with each generation, they became more independent, more like kings in their own territories. And then, around 2200 BCE, after nearly 500 years of stability, the Old Kingdom began to crumble. The Nile itself seemed to turn against Egypt. The floods, which had been so reliable, so predictable for thousands of years, began to fail. Some years the inundation was too low, leaving the fields parched and crops withering under the relentless sun. Famine crept across the land like a shadow. Inscriptions from this period speak of desperate times, of people eating their own children, of the Nile running red, of death walking the land. Modern scientists have discovered something remarkable. Around this time, a period of severe climate change affected the entire region. Volcanic eruptions in distant lands may have disrupted weather patterns. The monsoons that fed the Nile weakened. Egypt, which had seemed so eternal, so protected by the gods, was vulnerable to forces far beyond its borders. The central government weakened. The last pharaoh of the 6th dynasty, PP II, reigned for an astonishing 94 years. He came to the throne as a child and died as an ancient man. But this very longevity may have contributed to the collapse. By the time he died, the system was ossified, unable to adapt, and his successors were shadows, ruling in name only. Egypt fractured. The two lands became many lands. Nomarchs declared themselves independent rulers. In the delta, in the south, all across Egypt, local dynasties rose and fell like waves. This was the first intermediate period, a time of chaos that the Egyptians themselves remembered with horror. But even in darkness, there was light. In Heracleopolis, in Middle Egypt, a dynasty arose and claimed the throne, though their control was limited. And far to the south, in Thebes, a family of nomarchs grew strong. They watched the north with careful eyes, building their power, waiting. The Theban rulers called themselves the 11th dynasty, and slowly, methodically, they began to reunite Egypt. A warrior king named Mentuhotep II led armies north, fighting battle after battle against the Heracleopolitan kings. The war lasted for decades, but Mentuhotep was patient and determined. Finally, around 2050 BCE, after more than a century of division, Egypt was one kingdom again. Mentuhotep II wore the double crown, and the Egyptians could breathe once more. The Middle Kingdom had begun. But this Egypt was different from the old one. The pharaohs were still divine, yes, but they were also more human, more accessible. The literature of this period shows a change in thinking. There are texts where kings express doubt, where they acknowledge the weight of responsibility. One text, called the Prophecy of Neferti, looks back at the chaos of the intermediate period and describes it with such vivid horror that it must have been seared into the collective memory. The land is diminished, but its administrators are many. A man looks upon his son as his enemy. The river of Egypt is empty. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs learned from the collapse. They couldn't rely solely on divine authority anymore. They had to govern wisely, build infrastructure, care for their people. And they did. One of the greatest of these kings was Senusret III, who ruled around 1870 BCE. He was a warrior and a builder, but also an administrator who reorganized the government, breaking the power of the nomarchs who had contributed to the Old Kingdom's collapse. He created a more centralized state, with officials who answered directly to the king. Senusret III pushed Egypt's borders south into Nubia, that land of gold and exotic goods beyond the first cataract of the Nile. He built massive fortresses there, intimidating structures with thick walls and strategic positions commanding the Nile. These weren't just military installations. They were statements of power, trading posts, centers of Egyptian culture planted in foreign soil. Here's something beautiful. We have statues of Senusret III, and they don't show him as an idealized, eternally youthful god-king like the Old Kingdom pharaohs. Instead, we see a man with a careworn face, with lines of experience and perhaps weariness. His eyes gaze out with a kind of melancholy wisdom. These portraits are so human, so individual, that you feel you could recognize him if he walked into the room. Egyptian art was evolving, becoming more naturalistic, more willing to show reality. The Middle Kingdom was also a golden age of literature and culture. Scribes composed stories that are still read today. The tale of Sinew tells of an Egyptian official who flees to Syria after the death of his pharaoh, lives a full life in exile, but longs desperately to return home to Egypt and be buried in Egyptian soil. It's a story about identity, belonging, and the magnetic pull of home. It was so popular that copies have been found on broken pottery shards, papyrus fragments, and writing boards, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a bestseller. They wrote wisdom literature too, instructions from fathers to sons about how to live a good life. Be a craftsman in speech, one text advises, for the tongue is a sword. They valued education, eloquence, justice, and proper behavior. The concept of Ma'at, which meant truth, justice, order, and cosmic balance, became central to how Egyptians thought about the world. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Ma'at, to keep chaos at bay, to ensure the sun rose and the Nile flooded and society functioned as the gods intended. During this period, religious beliefs also democratized in a way. In the Old Kingdom, only the pharaoh was guaranteed an afterlife among the gods. But by the Middle Kingdom, any Egyptian who could afford the proper burial, the proper spells, the proper rituals, could hope for eternal life. The coffin texts, spells painted on the inside of wooden coffins, gave the deceased the magic they needed to navigate the dangerous journey through the underworld. They wrote of the Field of Reeds, a paradise that was essentially an idealized version of Egypt itself, where the deceased would farm and harvest in perfect peace, where the grain grew 7 cubits high, where there was no hunger, no suffering, no death. But the Middle Kingdom pharaohs knew that peace was fragile. They fortified Egypt's borders. To the south, those massive fortresses in Nubia. To the northeast, they built a series of forts called the Walls of the Ruler to control the movement of Asiatic peoples from the Levant. For 200 years, the Middle Kingdom flourished. Art reached new heights of refinement. The pharaohs built pyramids again, though now with cores of mud brick rather than solid stone, covered in white limestone. They dug canals and managed the Nile's flood waters with increased sophistication. They sent expeditions to far-off lands, to Punt on the Red Sea coast, to the turquoise mines of Sinai, to the cedar forests of Lebanon. But as the 12th dynasty gave way to the 13th, the pattern began to repeat. The central government weakened once more. Local rulers gained power. The Nile's floods became unreliable again. And this time, Egypt faced a new challenge, one that would come not from within, but from beyond its borders. In the Delta, foreigners had been settling for generations, traders, immigrants, people from the Levant seeking opportunities in wealthy Egypt. They brought new technologies, new ideas. And now, as Egypt weakened, they began to organize, to consolidate power. The Egyptians would call them the Hyksos, the foreign rulers. And their arrival would change Egypt forever, testing the kingdom in ways it had never been tested before. Rest now in the peace of the Field of Reeds, as we prepare to journey through the storm that is coming. The Delta had always been a place where cultures met and mingled. Its many branches of the Nile reached out like fingers toward the Mediterranean, and ships from distant lands sailed into its harbors. Merchants from Canaan and Syria brought cedar wood, olive oil, and wine. They brought new ideas, new words, new ways of doing things. And some of them stayed. Over generations, these Asiatic settlers in the Delta grew numerous. They built their own towns, maintained their own customs, worshipped their own gods alongside the Egyptian ones. And as Egypt's central government continued to weaken during the 13th dynasty, these foreign communities found themselves with an opportunity. Around 1650 BCE, a line of these foreign rulers established themselves in the city of Avaris in the eastern delta. The Egyptians called them Haikau Kasut, rulers of foreign lands, which the Greeks later corrupted into Hyksos. To proud Egyptians, who had always seen their land as the center of civilization, the idea of foreign kings ruling Egypt was almost incomprehensible, an overturning of the natural order of things. Later Egyptian propaganda would paint the Hyksos as brutal invaders who swept in with overwhelming military force, burning and destroying. But the truth, as archaeology reveals, was more nuanced. The Hyksos didn't conquer Egypt in a sudden invasion. They gradually accumulated power in the delta over time, filling a vacuum left by Egyptian weakness. They became pharaohs not through cataclysmic war, but through the slow process of political consolidation. Still, they were different. They brought with them technologies that Egypt had never seen before. The Hyksos introduced the composite bow, a bow made of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, capable of shooting arrows with far greater power and range than the simple bows Egyptians had used. They brought improved bronze-working techniques. And most significantly, they brought something that would revolutionize Egyptian warfare: the horse and chariot. Imagine the first time an Egyptian saw a chariot, a light, two-wheeled vehicle pulled by horses, moving across the battlefield at speeds that must have seemed impossible. Warriors standing in these chariots could rain arrows down on foot soldiers, then wheel away before anyone could catch them. It was like seeing a tank for the first time, a complete transformation of how war could be fought. The Hyksos ruled from Avaris, but their control didn't extend over all of Egypt. In the south, in Thebes, Egyptian rulers maintained their independence, calling themselves the 17th dynasty. They controlled Upper Egypt and paid tribute to the Hyksos in the north, a humiliating arrangement that must have burned in the hearts of proud Thebans who remembered when Egypt had been united and strong. For decades, this uneasy arrangement continued. Egypt was divided once again, the Hyksos in the north, the Thebans in the south, and various smaller rulers scattered in between. But in Thebes, resentment was building. The royal family that told stories of Egypt's glorious past, when pharaohs were truly divine, when the two lands were one, when foreigners knew their place. A Theban king named Seqenenre-Dao decided that enough was enough. According to later Egyptian legend, the Hyksos king Apophis sent him an insulting message, complaining that the hippopotamuses in Thebes were making so much noise that he couldn't sleep in Avaris, hundreds of miles away. Whether this story is true or simply reflects the tensions of the time, we know what happened next: war. Seqenenre-Dao's mummy tells a brutal story. His skull shows multiple traumatic wounds, blows from axes and spears that match Asiatic weapons of the period. He died in battle, fighting the Hyksos, and his body was hastily mummified, perhaps even on the battlefield. You can still see those wounds today, frozen in time, testament to his determination to drive out the foreign rulers. His son, Kamose, took up the fight. We have texts that record Kamose's fury at the situation. "Why do I contemplate my strength?" he says, "when one chief is in Avaris and another in Kush, and I sit united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each man in possession of his slice of Egypt." He launched campaigns north, attacking Hyksos' positions, achieving victories but not final success. He too died young, perhaps in battle. But the liberation would not be denied. Kamose's brother, Ahmose, was still a child when he became king, but when he came of age, he proved to be one of Egypt's greatest warrior pharaohs. Ahmose learned from the Hyksos, he adopted their technologies, built his own chariot corps, trained his armies in new tactics. He understood that to defeat the Hyksos, he needed to fight them on their own terms. Year after year, Ahmose pushed north. He besieged Avaris, the Hyksos' capital. The siege lasted years, but Ahmose was patient. His armies surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, wearing down the defenders. Finally, Avaris fell. The Hyksos rulers fled northeast, back toward Canaan, and Ahmose pursued them. He chased them to Sharuan, a fortified city in southern Canaan, and besieged it for 3 years until it too surrendered. Egypt was free. Egypt was united, and Ahmose, the liberator, founded a new dynasty, the 18th, and ushered in what historians would call the New Kingdom, the most powerful period in all of Egyptian history. But the experience of foreign rule had changed Egypt profoundly. Never again would the Egyptians be content to sit behind their natural borders and assume the world would leave them alone. The Hyksos period taught them that the desert was not enough protection, that threats could come from beyond their traditional borders. The New Kingdom pharaohs would be different from their predecessors. They would be warriors, conquerors, empire builders. They would push Egypt's boundaries into Nubia, into Canaan, into Syria. They would create a professional standing army, the first in Egyptian history. They would accumulate wealth and power beyond anything the Old or Middle Kingdom pharaohs had dreamed of. And interestingly, even as the Egyptians despised the Hyksos as foreign usurpers, they kept many of the innovations the Hyksos had brought. The composite bow became standard in Egyptian arsenals. The chariot became the weapon of pharaohs and nobles. Egyptian princes trained from childhood in chariot warfare, racing across the desert, shooting arrows at full gallop. New bronze working techniques improved Egyptian weapons and tools. Even some Asiatic gods found places in the Egyptian pantheon. Set, the Egyptian god of storms and chaos, became associated with the Hyksos storm god Baal, and was sometimes worshipped in the delta. There's a papyrus that survives from later in the New Kingdom, a mathematical text called the Rind Mathematical Papyrus, and it contains a curious note. The scribe who copied it writes that he is making this copy in the time of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Orzer, a Hyksos king, noting that this was during the period when Egypt was ruled by foreigners. It's a small detail, but it shows that even centuries later, the Hyksos period remained a vivid memory, a time when everything had been wrong, when Marat had been overturned. But from that chaos and humiliation, a new Egypt was being born. An Egypt that would march forth and build an empire. An Egypt that would become the superpower of the ancient world, whose pharaohs would be feared and respected from Nubia to Mesopotamia. An Egypt of warrior kings and magnificent queens, of temples that touched the sky, of treasures that still dazzle us today. The storm had passed. The sun was rising on Egypt's golden age. Let the dawn light fill your mind as we journey forward into the glory of the New Kingdom. Ahmose had driven out the Hyksos and reunited the two lands, but his work wasn't finished. He turned his attention south, to Nubia, where local rulers had taken advantage of Egypt's weakness to assert their independence. Ahmose marched his armies up the Nile, past the first cataract, restoring Egyptian control over the gold-rich lands of Kush. He wasn't just reuniting Egypt. He was building something larger, something that would become an empire. When Ahmose died after a reign of 25 years, he left behind a transformed Egypt. His successors continued his work, but they also turned their attention to internal matters, rebuilding temples, reorganizing the administration, establishing the structures that would support Egypt's golden age. And then came a succession crisis that would produce one of ancient Egypt's most remarkable rulers. Thutmose I had expanded Egypt's borders even further, campaigning in Syria and pushing deep into Nubia. But when he died, the succession was complicated. His son, Thutmose II, married his half-sister Hatshepsut. Royal marriages between siblings were common in Egypt, a way of keeping the divine bloodline pure. But Thutmose II was sickly and died young, leaving behind a young son, Thutmose III, born to a lesser wife. Hatshepsut became regent for the boy king. She had royal blood from both sides. Her father was a pharaoh, her mother was a king's daughter. She was intelligent, ambitious, and she understood power. For a few years, she governed in Thutmose III's name, as regents were expected to do. But then, around 7 years into the regency, something unprecedented happened. Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, pharaoh. She took all 5 royal names, as male kings did. She wore the false beard that symbolized kingship. In statues and reliefs, she was often depicted with the body of a man, wearing the royal kilt, bare-chested, every inch a king. Some images show her with a subtle feminine figure, but always with the regalia of a pharaoh. It was a bold claim, a woman taking a role that had always belonged to men, in a culture where tradition and precedent were sacred. Why did she do it? Perhaps she believed that only a pharaoh, not a regent, could properly maintain Marat, could perform the essential royal rituals that kept the cosmos in balance. Perhaps she saw threats to the young Thutmose III and believed her direct rule would provide stability. Or perhaps she simply believed she deserved to rule, that her royal blood and her abilities entitled her to the throne. We'll never know her exact reasoning, but we know that she succeeded. For more than 20 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and Egypt prospered. Hatshepsut's reign was marked not by war, but by peace and building. She launched trading expeditions that brought wealth flowing into Egypt. The most famous of these was the expedition to Punt, a mysterious land somewhere along the Red Sea coast, probably in modern Somalia or Eritrea. The journey to Punt was recorded in exquisite detail on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. We can see Egyptian ships being loaded with trade goods, sailing down the Red Sea, arriving in Punt where they are greeted by the local ruler and his wife. The Puntites lived in houses built on stilts, surrounded by exotic trees. The Egyptians traded for frankincense and myrrh, precious resins used in religious ceremonies, for ebony and ivory, for leopard skins, for living myrrh trees that were carefully transported back to Egypt and planted at Hatshepsut's temple. The reliefs show these myrrh trees in detail, their roots protected in baskets for the long journey home. Some of these trees survived for years at Deir el-Bahari. Archaeologists have found the dried-up root systems in the temple courtyards, silent witnesses to an expedition that took place 3,500 years ago. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple is itself a masterpiece, one of the most beautiful buildings ever created in ancient Egypt. It rises in 3 terraces against the towering cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, its colonnades creating patterns of light and shadow. The architect who designed it was named Senenmut, a commoner who rose to become one of Hatshepsut's most trusted advisors. Some historians believe they may have been lovers, though this is speculation. What we know for certain is that Senenmut was granted the extraordinary honor of hiding images of himself behind doors and in secret places throughout Hatshepsut's temple, ensuring his presence in her eternal monument. But what of young Thutmose III during all this time? He was alive, he was being trained in military matters, but Hatshepsut kept him in the background. The official inscriptions barely mention him. Was he resentful, patient, biding his time? The records are silent. When Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE, Thutmose III finally became sole ruler. He was probably in his early 30s by then, and he had waited a long time. And the world was about to discover what kind of pharaoh he would be. Thutmose III was a military genius, perhaps the greatest warrior Egypt ever produced. Within months of taking sole power, he launched the first of what would be 17 military campaigns into Syria and Canaan over the next 20 years. His goal was to secure Egypt's northern borders and establish Egyptian dominance over the wealthy cities and trade routes of the Levant. His first campaign was the most famous. The cities of the Levant had formed a coalition against Egypt, led by the king of Kadesh. They gathered their armies at a fortress city called Megiddo, strategically located at a pass through the Carmel mountain range. Megiddo controlled a vital trade route, and it was strongly fortified. The coalition believed they were safe there. Thutmose III marched north with his army. When he reached the Carmel Ridge, his generals advised him to take one of two longer, easier routes around the mountains. But there was also a third route, a narrow pass that led directly to Megiddo, a path so narrow that horses and chariots would have to proceed in single file. His generals warned that it was too dangerous. If the enemy ambushed them in the pass, the Egyptian army would be destroyed. But Thutmose saw an opportunity. He gambled that the enemy wouldn't expect him to take such a risk. "I will proceed on this Aruna road," he declared, and he vowed to lead the way himself, to show his men he would share whatever danger they faced. The army threaded through the narrow pass, vulnerable, tense, expecting attack at any moment. But the coalition forces, certain that Thutmose would take one of the safer routes, had positioned their armies to block those paths. When the Egyptian vanguard emerged from the pass near Megiddo, the enemy was out of position, caught completely by surprise. Thutmose III ordered his army to wait though, gathering all his forces before attacking. The next morning, he struck. His army was organized with precision, infantry in the center, chariots on the wings. He rode in a golden chariot at the head of his troops, and when battle was joined, the coalition forces broke and fled back toward the city. Here, the Egyptian soldiers made a mistake. Instead of pressing the pursuit and capturing the fleeing enemy, they stopped to loot the abandoned enemy camp, seizing tents, weapons, horses, and treasure. The coalition leaders escaped into Megiddo, and the city closed its gates. Thutmose's annals record his frustration. If only the army of His Majesty had not given their hearts to looting the possessions of the enemy, they would have captured Megiddo at this moment. So instead of a quick victory, Thutmose had to lay siege to the city. He surrounded Megiddo with a fortification of his own, cutting off all supplies. For 7 months the siege continued, until finally, starving and hopeless, Megiddo surrendered. The victory was total. The coalition was shattered. The captured loot was staggering. 894 chariots, 200 suits of armor, thousands of horses, uncounted weapons. The princes of the defeated cities came out and prostrated themselves before the pharaoh. And Thutmose was merciful. He allowed most of them to keep their thrones, as long as they swore loyalty to Egypt and sent tribute annually. This battle, the Battle of Megiddo, fought in 1457 BCE, is the first battle in history for which we have detailed tactical records. Thutmose III had scribes accompany his campaigns, recording everything in daily annals. These records were later carved on the walls of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, where you can still read them today. Lists of captured cities, tribute received, distances marched, a meticulous chronicle of empire building. Year after year, Thutmose returned to Syria, consolidating his control, putting down rebellions, pushing Egyptian power northward until he reached the Euphrates River, farther than any Egyptian army had ever gone. He set up a victory stela beside the river, claiming to have chased his enemies across it. The Egyptian empire was at its greatest extent. But Thutmose wasn't just a warrior. He brought back exotic plants and animals from his campaigns, creating a garden of foreign species at Karnak. He patronized the arts. He built extensively, adding to temples throughout Egypt. And late in his reign, he did something curious. He ordered the erasure of Hatshepsut's name and images from many monuments, replacing them with his own or those of his father and grandfather. Why? Was it revenge for being kept from power for so long? Was it an attempt to erase the anomaly of a female pharaoh from history, to restore proper order? Or was it simply standard practice, ensuring that the royal line appeared unbroken, with no confusing irregularities? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that when Thutmose III died after ruling for 54 years, 32 of them as sole king, he left behind an empire that stretched from Nubia to Syria, a wealthy, powerful, confident Egypt that saw itself as the greatest civilization on earth. The sun stood high over Egypt, but every sun must eventually set. Rest in the shadow of great temples as we continue our journey through time. The empire Thutmose III built endured for generations. Pharaohs came and went, maintaining Egyptian dominance through diplomacy and occasional military campaigns. The wealth of subject territories flowed into Egypt, gold from Nubia, tribute from Syria, exotic goods from across the known world. The priests of Amun, the king of the gods, grew fabulously wealthy, their temples at Karnak expanding into the largest religious complex in the ancient world. But then, around 1353 BCE, a pharaoh ascended to the throne who would attempt to overturn everything Egypt had believed for thousands of years. His birth name was Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied. He was the son of Amenhotep III, who had ruled during a golden age of peace and prosperity. But the young prince had a vision, a religious revelation that he believed superseded all the old ways. When he became pharaoh, he would change his name to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. The Aten was the sun disk, the physical manifestation of the sun itself. It had always been one aspect of Egyptian religion, but Akhenaten declared that the Aten was the only true god. Not the most important god, the only god. It was a radical form of monotheism in a world that had always been comfortably polytheistic. Imagine the shock. Amun, who had been worshipped for centuries, whose priests controlled vast wealth and lands, was to be abandoned. Osiris, Isis, Horus, Thoth, all the gods the Egyptians had prayed to since time immemorial, were false. Only the Aten existed. Only the Aten mattered. Akhenaten didn't stop at proclamation. He closed temples throughout Egypt. He ordered the name of Amun to be chiseled off monuments, erasing the god from history. And he did something even more dramatic. He abandoned Thebes, the traditional capital, and built an entirely new city in the middle of nowhere, on a pristine site in Middle Egypt that had never been dedicated to any other god. He called this city Aketon, Horizon of the Aten. Today we know it as Amarna. In an incredible burst of construction, a complete city rose from the desert: palaces, temples, administrative buildings, houses for nobles and workers, workshops for artists. The city was built so quickly that the plaster on some walls was still wet when people moved in. The art created during this period was unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Traditional Egyptian art was formal, idealized. Pharaohs were shown as eternally young, physically perfect, following strict conventions that had been established centuries earlier. But Amarna art was startlingly different. Akhenaten had himself portrayed with an elongated face, a long neck, a pot belly, wide hips, and spindly legs. His wife, Nefertiti, and their daughters were shown in intimate family scenes, the royal family relaxing together, Akhenaten kissing his daughters, the princesses sitting casually on cushions. Nefertiti, her name means the beautiful one has come, and she was powerful in a way few Egyptian queens had been since Hatshepsut. She appears in official reliefs performing rituals usually reserved for the pharaoh. There's evidence she may have even ruled as co-regent with Akhenaten. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered at Amarna and now in Berlin, shows a woman of such refined beauty that it has captivated viewers for over a century. Her cheekbones, her graceful neck, the subtle smile on her lips, she seems almost alive, even after 3,300 years. But Akhenaten's revolution was crumbling even as he lived it. The Egyptian people, attached to their traditional gods, never truly accepted the Atum. The powerful priesthood of Amun seethed with resentment. And while Akhenaten focused on his religious vision, Egypt's empire began to fray. Letters found at Amarna, correspondence between the pharaoh and vassal rulers in Syria and Canaan, show increasing desperation. The rulers begged for Egyptian troops, for help against enemies, but Akhenaten seemed uninterested in military affairs. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, his revolution died with him. His successor, possibly his son, possibly his brother, was a boy of about 9 years old. His birth name had been Tutankhaten, living image of the Atum, but powerful advisors, including the general Horem and the official A, convinced the boy king to abandon Amarna and return to Thebes, to restore the old gods, to bring back Marat. The boy changed his name to Tutankhamen, living image of Amun. The old religion was restored. Akhenaten was abandoned, and the desert sands slowly began to reclaim it. Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists. He became the enemy, the criminal of Akhenaten, remembered only as a heretic who had nearly destroyed Egypt. And Tutankhamen, he reigned for about 10 years, dying when he was only 18 or 19 years old. His death was unexpected. Recent CT scans of his mummy show he had a broken leg that may have become infected, and he suffered from malaria. He was buried in a small tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a tomb originally intended for someone else, hastily adapted for the young pharaoh. For over 3,000 years, Tutankhamen lay forgotten. His tomb was so small, so obscure, that even ancient tomb robbers overlooked it. The entrance was buried when later tombs were cut into the valley, their debris covering his doorway. And there he slept, surrounded by treasures, while empires rose and fell above. Until November 4th, 1922, when an archaeologist named Howard Carter, after years of searching, found a step cut into the bedrock. More steps appeared, a sealed doorway. Carter made a small hole in the door and held up a candle. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied with words that would echo through history, "Yes, wonderful things." Inside was a chaos of treasures, chariots, beds shaped like animals, chairs, weapons, jewelry, statues, all jumbled together. And beyond that, another sealed doorway. And beyond that, a room almost entirely filled with a golden shrine. And inside that shrine, another shrine, and another. 4 shrines nested one inside the other, and within them, a stone sarcophagus. Inside the sarcophagus, 3 coffins nested together. The innermost coffin was made of solid gold, weighing 110 kilograms, almost 250 pounds of gold. And inside that golden coffin was Tutankhamun himself, his face covered by a golden mask of such exquisite beauty that it has become one of the most recognized objects in the world. The mask shows an idealized young king, wearing the royal Nemes headdress with the cobra and vulture of unified Egypt on his brow. His eyes are outlined in lapis lazuli, his beard is braided in the divine style. He gazes serenely into eternity. If Tutankhamun's tomb, the tomb of a minor king who ruled only briefly, contained such treasures, imagine what must have been in the tombs of great pharaohs like Thutmose III or Ramesses II. We will never know. Those tombs were all plundered in antiquity. But Ramesses II, he needs no tomb treasures to ensure his immortality. His monuments still stand across Egypt, proclaiming his greatness. Ramesses II came to the throne around 1279 BCE and ruled for an astonishing 66 years. He lived into his 90s, outliving many of his own children. And he spent those decades building monuments on a scale that made even the pyramid builders seem modest. At Abu Simbel in Nubia, he carved an entire temple out of a cliff face. 4 colossal statues of Ramesses, each 65 feet tall, sit at the entrance, staring out across the desert. Twice a year, on the dates that may have been Ramesses's birthday and coronation day, the rising sun penetrates deep into the temple, illuminating statues of the gods in the sanctuary, a feat of engineering and astronomy that still awes visitors today. At Luxor, at Karnak, at Memphis, at sites throughout Egypt, Ramesses built temples, statues, obelisks. He had his name carved on monuments of previous pharaohs, claiming their work as his own. He was the greatest self-promoter Egypt ever knew, ensuring that no one could forget the name Ramesses. But he was also a warrior. Early in his reign, he fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittite Empire, the other great superpower of the age. Ramesses rode into what he thought would be an easy victory, but it was a trap. The Hittites ambushed his army, and Ramesses found himself surrounded with only his personal guard. According to his own account, carved on multiple temple walls, he called upon the god Amun, and with divine aid, he fought his way out, single-handedly routing the enemy. The reality was probably less dramatic. Likely his other divisions arrived just in time to save him from disaster. The battle was, at best, a draw. But Ramesses proclaimed it a great victory and commissioned endless reliefs showing his heroic deeds. He knew the power of propaganda. Eventually, Egypt and the Hittites made peace, signing a treaty that survives today, one copy in Egyptian hieroglyphs, another in Hittite cuneiform. It's one of the oldest peace treaties in human history, and Ramesses sealed it by marrying a Hittite princess, adding her to his already numerous wives. When Ramesses finally died, after his impossibly long reign, Egypt mourned. An entire generation had known no other pharaoh. His mummy shows he had arthritis, dental abscesses, and hardened arteries. He had red hair, even in old age, and he left behind a kingdom that was still strong, still wealthy, but facing challenges that his successors would struggle to meet. Let the golden light of Ramesses's sunset illuminate your rest as we move toward twilight. After Ramesses II's death, his son Meremptah took the throne, but he was already elderly, having waited decades for his father to die. He ruled for only 10 years, and those years brought troubling news. Inscriptions from his reign speak of defeating Libyan invaders who had tried to settle in the delta, pushed from their homelands by drought and famine. And there's a curious mention on a victory stela. A people called Israel are listed among defeated enemies in Canaan. It's the only mention of Israel in all of ancient Egyptian texts, a tiny footnote in Egyptian history, but significant to us as the earliest reference to the Israelites outside the Bible. The throne passed through several short-lived pharaohs, and then, around 1186 BCE, the last great warrior pharaoh of Egypt took power, Ramesses III. Ramesses III consciously modeled himself on his illustrious namesake, Ramesses II. He built his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu with the same grandeur, covered its walls with the same kinds of victory scenes. But the enemies Ramesses III faced were unlike anything Egypt had encountered before. They came from the sea and from the land, a confederation of peoples fleeing some catastrophe in the Aegean and Anatolia. We don't know exactly what drove them, perhaps earthquakes, perhaps famine, perhaps invasions in their own homelands. The Egyptians called them simply the Sea Peoples, mysterious names that echo across the centuries: Pele Set, Tieka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. These weren't organized empires or kingdoms, but migrations of desperate peoples, entire populations on the move with their families and possessions, fighting their way through the eastern Mediterranean. And they were destroying everything in their path. The great Hittite Empire collapsed. Cities throughout Syria, Canaan, and Anatolia burned. Cyprus was overrun. The palace cultures of Mycenaean Greece crumbled. Bronze Age civilization itself was dying, and the Sea Peoples were part of the chaos sweeping across the world. They came to Egypt in two great waves during Ramesses III's reign. First, around 1180 BCE, a coalition of Libyans and Sea Peoples attacked from the west. Ramesses III met them in battle and drove them back. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show the dead piled high, and inscriptions boast of thousands killed and captured. But 5 years later, they came again, this time in even greater numbers. They advanced by land through Canaan and by sea along the coast, their ox-cats carrying women and children, their ships filled with warriors. Egypt prepared for total war. At the mouths of the Nile, Ramesses III set a trap. He positioned archers along the banks and drew the Sea People's ships into the narrow channels of the delta, where they couldn't maneuver. Egyptian ships surrounded them, and the archers rained arrows down from the shore. The reliefs show a desperate naval battle, ships grappling, warriors fighting hand-to-hand, Sea Peoples drowning in the Nile. It was one of the first recorded naval battles in history, and Egypt won. On land, the Egyptian army met the Sea Peoples in battle and defeated them. The migration was stopped. Egypt survived when so many other civilizations had fallen. The Sea Peoples settled in Canaan, The Pele set became the Philistines of the Bible, but they would never threaten Egypt again. Yet the victory came at tremendous cost. The wars had drained the treasury. The international trade networks that had brought wealth to Egypt for centuries were shattered. The Bronze Age world of interconnected kingdoms and peaceful trade was over, replaced by a darker, more fragmented time that historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. And Egypt itself was changing in troubling ways. Tomb robberies became epidemic. Even the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings were violated, their treasures stolen by organized gangs. Trial records survived describing how priests and officials interrogated thieves who had broken into the pyramid of the pharaoh Sekhemre-Shedtoi and stolen gold. The thieves confessed under torture. "We opened their coffins and stripped off the gold which we found on the mummy of this god. We found the queen likewise and stripped off all that we found on her. We set fire to their coffins." Even the bodies of the pharaohs weren't safe. Think of the horror, the violation. These were beings the Egyptians considered divine, and thieves were tearing apart their mummies for the gold amulets wrapped in the linen. The priests eventually had to move the royal mummies in secret, hiding them in caches to protect them. In 1881, archaeologists discovered one such cache at Deir el-Bahari, 40 mummies of kings and queens, including Ramesses II himself, hidden away in a simple shaft tomb. They had been there for nearly 3,000 years, protected by secrecy after their grand tombs had failed to protect them. Ramesses III himself met a terrible end. Court documents describe a conspiracy in his harem. One of his secondary wives, hoping to place her son on the throne, organized a plot to assassinate the pharaoh. They succeeded. Ramesses III was murdered, though the conspirators were caught and executed. The king's mummy shows a deep cut across his throat, hidden beneath the wrappings, a wound that would have been fatal. After Ramesses III, Egypt entered a slow decline. 8 more pharaohs took the name Ramesses, but they were shadows of the great warrior kings. Ramesses from 4th to 11th, their reigns grew shorter, their power weaker. The empire in Syria and Canaan was lost. The gold mines in Nubia became harder to access as Egyptian control there weakened. And then the unthinkable happened. The high priest of Amun in Thebes, a man named Herihor, declared himself equal in power to the pharaoh. He took royal titles, wore royal regalia. Egypt was effectively divided, pharaohs ruling from the delta in the north, while the priests of Amun controlled the south from Thebes. When the last Ramesses died around 1077 BCE, the new kingdom died with him. Egypt fractured once again into the Third Intermediate Period, a time of division and foreign rulers that would last for 4 centuries. In the north, pharaohs of Libyan descent established themselves, descendants of Libyan soldiers who had served in the Egyptian army and gradually accumulated power. The 21st, 22nd, and 23rd dynasties were all Libyan in origin. They were Egyptianized, they adopted Egyptian customs, spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, but they were not ethnically Egyptian. These Libyan pharaohs ruled from cities in the delta like Tanis, where archaeologists have discovered royal tombs filled with treasure that rival even Tutankhamun's. Silver coffins shaped like falcons, golden masks, jewelry of exquisite workmanship. The Libyan pharaohs may not have controlled a vast empire, but they were still wealthy and sophisticated. In the south, Thebes remained semi-independent, ruled by the high priests of Amun. Sometimes there was cooperation between north and south. Often there was tension. Egypt was no longer truly one kingdom. And then, around 747 BCE, something remarkable happened. From Nubia, from the south, a new power arose. The kingdom of Kush, which had once been Egypt's subject, had grown strong. The Kushite kings had absorbed Egyptian culture deeply. They worshipped Egyptian gods, built pyramids, wrote in hieroglyphs. In many ways, they saw themselves as more authentically Egyptian than the Libyan pharaohs in the Delta. A Kushite king named Pia decided that Egypt needed to be reunited, that Ma'at needed to be restored. He marched north with his army, not as a foreign conqueror, but as a righteous liberator. City after city opened their gates to him. When he reached Memphis, the ancient capital, he had to lay siege, but eventually it fell. The Delta pharaohs submitted to him, and Pia became pharaoh of all Egypt. Pia erected a great stela describing his conquest, and it's one of the most detailed historical narratives from ancient Egypt. But here's what's remarkable. After conquering Egypt, after receiving the submission of all the northern rulers, Pia went home to Nubia. He returned to his capital at Napata, near the fourth cataract of the Nile, far to the south. Egypt was theoretically unified under his rule, but he preferred to govern from Kush. His successors, the 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty, were more hands-on. Pharaohs like Shabaka and Taharqa ruled from Egypt itself, building temples, patronizing the arts, presenting themselves as restorers of Egypt's ancient glory. Taharqa was particularly devoted to the god Amun and built extensively at Karnak. But the Nubian pharaohs faced a threat from the east that would prove insurmountable. A new empire was rising in Mesopotamia, conquering everything before it with iron weapons and ruthless efficiency. The Assyrians had already destroyed Israel and threatened Judah, and now they turned their eyes toward the ancient land of Egypt. The shadow of coming empires grows long across the desert. Rest now, as our journey continues toward the final chapters. The Assyrian Empire was unlike anything the world had seen before. From their capital at Nineveh, the Assyrian kings commanded armies equipped with iron weapons, siege engines, and a military organization that could coordinate campaigns across vast distances. They were methodical, ruthless, and unstoppable. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Taharqa, the Nubian pharaoh, fought bravely, but he had never faced an enemy like this. The Assyrians pushed south, captured Memphis, and forced Taharqa to flee back to Nubia. Esarhaddon declared himself king of Egypt, Kush, and the four corners of the world. But Egypt was not so easily held. As soon as the Assyrians withdrew, Taharqa returned and reclaimed his throne. The Assyrians had to invade again, and again. For 2 decades, this pattern repeated. Assyrian conquest, Egyptian rebellion, Assyrian reconquest. The land was devastated by constant warfare. Finally, in 664 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal lost patience. He invaded with overwhelming force, drove the Nubians out permanently, and in his fury, sacked Thebes itself. The great city, the religious heart of Egypt, home to the magnificent temples of Karnak and Luxor, was plundered. The Assyrians carried off statues, obelisks, treasures that had accumulated for over 1,000 years. It was a catastrophe that shocked the ancient world. Even the Bible mentions it, the prophet Nahum asking rhetorically, "Are you better than Thebes, situated on the Nile?" But the Assyrians didn't want to rule Egypt directly. It was too far from their heartland, too difficult to control. Instead, they installed local rulers as vassals. One of these was a prince from the delta city of Sais, named Psamtik. Psamtik I was clever and patient. He served the Assyrians loyally, until the moment he didn't. As the Assyrian Empire became overstretched, fighting wars on multiple fronts, Psamtik quietly built his own power base. He hired Greek mercenaries, warriors from across the Mediterranean who were happy to fight for Egyptian gold. He made alliances with other Delta princes. And when the time was right, around 656 BCE, he simply stopped acknowledging Assyrian authority. The Assyrians were too busy with other problems to do anything about it. Egypt was independent again. Psamtik I ruled for 54 years and founded the 26th dynasty, what historians call the Civilisation period, named after his capital at Sais. It was a renaissance of sorts, a time when Egypt tried to recapture the glory of its past. The Civilisation pharaohs were deeply nostalgic. They studied the art and architecture of the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, copying ancient styles with remarkable precision. If you look at statues from this period, you might think they were from 1,000 years earlier. The same idealized features, the same poses, the same hieroglyphic inscriptions. But look closer, and you can see subtle differences, a slightly different sensibility. They were consciously creating a golden age by imitating golden ages past. This was also a time when Egypt opened to the world in new ways. Greek merchants and settlers established trading posts in the delta. The city of Naucratis became a Greek enclave on Egyptian soil, with temples to Greek gods standing alongside Egyptian ones. Greek and Carian mercenaries served in the pharaoh's armies, and some rose to positions of influence. Egypt was becoming cosmopolitan, multicultural. The Civilisation pharaohs also campaigned abroad. Psamtik II led an expedition deep into Nubia, and Greek mercenaries in his army carved their names on the colossal statues at Abu Simbel, graffiti from 591 BCE that you can still read today. Proud declarations in Greek letters. When King Psammetichus came to Elephantine, this was written by those who sailed with Psammeticus. But the world was changing in fundamental ways. Egypt's independence existed only because the great empires to the east were distracted. The Assyrian Empire collapsed in the 620s and 610s BCE, destroyed by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. But the Babylonians simply took their place as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. And then, in the 550s BCE, a new empire arose from Persia that would dwarf even the Assyrians. Cyrus the Great united the Medes and Persians, conquered Babylon, took Lydia and Anatolia, and created an empire that stretched from India to the Mediterranean. His successor, Cambyses II, looked at Egypt, the last great independent power, and decided it too must fall. In 525 BCE, Cambyses invaded Egypt. The pharaoh Psamtik III, who had ruled for only 6 months, marched out to meet him. They clashed at Pelusim, at the entrance to the delta. The battle was fierce, but the Persians had the larger army, better organization, and iron discipline. The Egyptians broke and fled. Psamtik retreated to Memphis, but the city fell after a brief siege. Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire, ruled by a satrap, a Persian governor. The age of independent Egyptian pharaohs was over, or so it seemed. Interestingly, the Persians tried to rule Egypt carefully at first. Cambyses took Egyptian throne names and presented himself as a legitimate pharaoh. He made offerings to Egyptian gods and tried to show respect for Egyptian customs. But the Egyptians never truly accepted Persian rule. They told stories of Cambyses committing sacrilege, of killing the sacred Apis bull, of mocking their religion. Whether these stories were true or Persian propaganda invented by the Egyptians, they reflected deep resentment. Under Darius I, who succeeded Cambyses, Egypt was incorporated into the Persian administrative system. The country was prosperous. Darius completed a canal connecting the Nile to the Red Sea, facilitating trade. He built temples and left inscriptions and hieroglyphs alongside Persian cuneiform. But Egypt was no longer the master of its own destiny. Then, in 404 BCE, opportunity struck. The Persian Empire was distracted by rebellions and succession crises. An Egyptian prince named Amertius, ruling in the Delta Marshes, declared independence. He drove out the Persian garrison and established the 28th dynasty, though it consisted only of himself and lasted just 6 years. But it was a beginning. When Amertius died, a family from Mendes in the Delta took power as the 29th dynasty. And then, in 380 BCE, a general named Nectanebo I seized the throne and founded the 30th dynasty, the last native Egyptian dynasty that would ever rule. These final Egyptian pharaohs fought desperately to maintain independence. They fortified Egypt's borders, hired Greek mercenaries by the thousands, formed alliances with the Greek city-states against Persia. Nectanebo I and his successors were prolific builders, constructing temples throughout Egypt. At Philae, at Edfu, at Dendera, temples were begun or expanded. Many of the temples tourists visit in Egypt today are actually from this late period, not from the age of the pyramids. Nectanebo II, the last native pharaoh of Egypt, was particularly devoted to temple building. But he also knew that Persian vengeance was coming. The Persian king Artaxerxes III was determined to reconquer Egypt, to punish this rebellious province. In 343 BCE, Artaxerxes invaded with a massive army. Nectanebo fought battle after battle, but he was overwhelmed. The Persians pushed through the Delta defenses, captured city after city. Finally, Nectanebo realized the fight was hopeless. Rather than die or be captured, he fled south, perhaps hoping to continue resistance from Upper Egypt, perhaps seeking refuge in Nubia. He disappears from history at that point. No one knows his final fate. But Egypt fell once more under Persian rule, the Second Persian period. And this time, the Persians were not gentle. There was no pretense of respecting Egyptian customs. Egypt was simply a conquered province to be exploited. The Persians stripped temples of their wealth, imposed heavy taxes, and ruled harshly. The Egyptians suffered under their yoke and prayed to their gods for deliverance. And their prayers would be answered, but by a deliverer from an unexpected direction. To the west, in the small kingdom of Macedon on the fringes of the Greek world, a young king was rising to power. He was brilliant, ambitious, and destined to change the world. His name was Alexander, and he was coming to Egypt. In 334 BCE, Alexander III of Macedon crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of 35,000 men. He was 22 years old, and he carried with him a copy of Homer's Iliad, dreaming of matching the heroes of old. Within 2 years, He had defeated the Persian king Darius III in 2 major battles, conquering Anatolia and Syria. And then he turned south toward Egypt. The Persian satrap who governed Egypt had no army capable of resisting Alexander. The Egyptian people had no love for their Persian overlords. So when Alexander arrived at Pelusium in 332 BCE, the fortress opened its gates without a fight. He marched to Memphis, and the Egyptians welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Alexander understood the power of symbols. He made sacrifices to the sacred Apis bull, the living embodiment of the god Ptah, showing respect for Egyptian religion in a way the Persians never had. The priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh, giving him the traditional 5 royal names. Alexander the Great became an Egyptian god-king, a living Horus. But Alexander was curious about something deeper. He had heard of the oracle of Amun at the oasis of Siwa, deep in the western desert. This oracle was famous throughout the ancient world for its prophecies. Alexander decided he needed to consult it, and so he set out across the desert with a small party. The journey was perilous. Legend says they were saved from dying of thirst when sudden rains fell, and guided when they were lost by ravens sent by the gods. When Alexander reached Siwa, he entered the temple alone to consult the oracle. What was said there, no one knows. Alexander never told anyone the full details. But when he emerged, he seemed changed, confirmed in his conviction that he was destined for greatness, perhaps even convinced of his own divinity. Some ancient sources claim the oracle confirmed that Alexander was the son of Zeusimon himself. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander chose the site for a new city on the Mediterranean coast, near the fishing village of Rakotes. Here, he said, a great city would rise, bearing his name, Alexandria. He traced out the city's boundaries himself, and his architects began planning a metropolis that would rival any city in the world. But Alexander didn't stay to see it built. He marched east, continuing his conquest of the Persian Empire, pushing all the way to India. He never returned to Egypt. In 323 BCE, in Babylon, at the age of just 32, Alexander died, possibly of fever, possibly of poison. The cause remains a mystery. His body was supposed to be returned to Macedon, but one of his generals, Ptolemy, intercepted the funeral cortege and brought Alexander's remains to Egypt. Eventually, Alexander was entombed in Alexandria, in a magnificent mausoleum where people would come to pay respects for centuries. The tomb's location is now lost, buried somewhere beneath the modern city, one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Ptolemy was clever and ambitious. In the wars that followed Alexander's death, as his generals fought over the empire, Ptolemy secured Egypt for himself. He declared himself pharaoh in 305 BCE, founding a dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Ptolemies were Greek, spoke Greek, and brought Greek culture to Egypt. But they also understood that to rule Egypt, they needed to be Egyptian pharaohs. So they performed the ancient rituals, built temples to Egyptian gods, and presented themselves in traditional Egyptian art as divine kings, indistinguishable from the pharaohs of old. Alexandria became their capital, and it grew into one of the most magnificent cities of the ancient world. It had a grid plan with wide streets, magnificent public buildings, palaces, and gardens. 2 harbors served ships from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II created two structures that would make Alexandria legendary. First, the Library of Alexandria, not just a collection of scrolls, but an institution dedicated to gathering all the knowledge of the world. Scholars came from everywhere to study there. The library eventually held hundreds of thousands of scrolls, works of literature, science, mathematics, philosophy, medicine. When ships docked in Alexandria's harbor, their books were confiscated, copied by scribes, and the copies returned to the owners while the originals went into the library. It was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. And then there was the lighthouse, the pharaohs of Alexandria. Built on an island in the harbor, it stood perhaps 350 feet tall, visible from 30 miles out at sea. A fire burned at its top, perhaps magnified by mirrors, guiding ships safely to port. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it stood for over 1,000 years before earthquakes finally brought it down. Alexandria was a cosmopolitan city where Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, and people from across the known world mixed and traded. The Greek poet Callimachus worked in the library. The mathematician Euclid developed his geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using observations from Alexandria and Sine, modern Aswan. Archimedes may have studied there in his youth. But outside Alexandria, in the ancient cities along the Nile, traditional Egyptian culture continued. The Ptolemies built temples in the pure Egyptian style, covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions. At Edfu, the Temple of Horus still stands, one of the best preserved temples in Egypt, built entirely during the Ptolemaic period. At Kom Ombo, at Dendera, at Philly, temples rose that followed ancient patterns perfectly. Egyptian priests performed rituals that stretched back millennia. What's remarkable is that you can see the same Ptolemaic ruler depicted in two completely different ways. In Alexandria, in Greek-style sculpture, a Ptolemy might appear as a Hellenistic king with rulistic features. But on temple walls in Thebes, that same king appears in pure Egyptian style, wearing the double crown, making offerings to Amun and Isis, a traditional pharaoh indistinguishable from Rameses or Thutmose. The early Ptolemies kept the empire together and maintained Egypt's prosperity. But as generations passed, the dynasty grew weaker. The Ptolemies adopted the pharaonic practice of brother-sister marriage to keep the bloodline pure, but this led to complex family dynamics and vicious power struggles. Ptolemy IV murdered his own mother. Ptolemy VIII massacred his enemies at a banquet. Queens named Cleopatra and Berenice fought for power, sometimes ruling jointly with brothers who were also their husbands, sometimes murdering those brothers to rule alone. The court was a nest of intrigue, poisoning, and assassination. By the 2nd century BCE, Egypt was still wealthy, but the Ptolemies were losing their territories abroad. Cyprus, parts of Syria, cities along the coast. Slowly the empire shrank until only Egypt remained. The library began to decay. The great scholars stopped coming. The Roman Republic was rising in the west, growing stronger, more aggressive, expanding across the Mediterranean. Egypt tried to maintain independence through diplomacy, allying with Rome, playing Roman factions against each other. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Egypt was weak, divided by internal strife. Rome was powerful and hungry for Egypt's grain, its gold, its legendary wealth. And then, in 51 BCE, an 18-year-old princess became co-ruler with her 10-year-old brother. Her name was Cleopatra, the seventh of that name, but the one who would be remembered forever. She was intelligent, educated in the best Greek tradition, fluent in multiple languages including Egyptian. She was reportedly the first Ptolemy in 300 years who could actually speak to her Egyptian subjects in their own language. She was politically astute, understanding that Egypt's survival depended on navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics. And the world she entered was about to be torn apart by civil war. Cleopatra's Egypt was a shadow of its former glory, but it was still rich, still important, still capable of tipping the balance of power in the Mediterranean world. And Cleopatra understood this. She knew that Egypt's independence depended on choosing the right allies in Rome's brutal power struggles. When she took the throne, she was supposed to rule jointly with her brother, Ptolemy XIII, but the court advisors who controlled the young king saw her as a threat. Within 3 years, they had driven her out of Alexandria. Cleopatra fled to Syria, where she began raising an army to reclaim her throne. And then, in 48 BCE, the Roman civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey reached Egypt's shores. Pompey, fleeing after his defeat at Pharsalus, arrived in Alexandria seeking refuge. But Ptolemy's advisors, hoping to win Caesar's favor, murdered Pompey as he stepped ashore and presented his severed head to Caesar when the Roman general arrived days later. Caesar was horrified. Pompey had been his enemy, yes, but also his former son-in-law and a great Roman. This treacherous murder offended Caesar's sense of dignity. He took control of Alexandria, installed himself in the royal palace, and demanded that Cleopatra and Ptolemy settle their differences under his mediation. Cleopatra seized her chance. Legend says she had herself smuggled into the palace rolled up in a carpet, which was unrolled at Caesar's feet. Whether this story is true or not, we know that Cleopatra impressed Caesar profoundly. She was intelligent, charming, cultured. She could discuss philosophy, poetry, and politics in Greek. She was in her early 20s, he was 52, and they became lovers. Caesar supported Cleopatra against her brother. War erupted in Alexandria. Part of the Great Library may have burned during the fighting, a tragedy beyond measure. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile trying to escape. Caesar placed Cleopatra back on the throne, now ruling jointly with an even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. Cleopatra bore Caesar a son, whom she named Caesar Yon, Little Caesar. The boy was the only known son of Julius Caesar, and Cleopatra made sure everyone knew it. She brought her son to Rome when Caesar invited her to visit, staying in one of Caesar's villas, a foreign queen in the heart of the Republic. Some Romans were scandalized, but Caesar was at the height of his power, and no one could stop him. Until March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, when senators surrounded Julius Caesar in the theater of Pompeii and stabbed him 23 times, crying out for liberty and the restoration of the Republic. Cleopatra fled Rome, returning to Egypt. Her young brother-husband Ptolemy XIV died shortly after, most likely poisoned on her orders. She made Caesar Yon her co-ruler. She was determined to survive, to keep Egypt independent, no matter what happened in Rome. Rome plunged into another civil war. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, fled east to raise armies. Caesar's heir, his adopted son Octavian, and Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony formed an alliance to hunt down the assassins. At Philippi in Greece, In 42 BCE, they crushed the Republican forces. Brutus and Cassius died by their own hands. The Roman world was divided. Octavian took the west. Mark Antony took the east. And Antony, needing resources for his planned campaign against the Parthian Empire, summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in Cilicia. Cleopatra arrived in spectacular fashion. Ancient sources describe her sailing up the river in a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants costumed as sea nymphs, with musicians filling the air with music and perfume wafting from the ship. It was pure theater, calculated to overwhelm and impress. And it worked. Mark Antony was captivated. He was a charismatic, larger-than-life Roman general, brave in battle but also pleasure-loving and impulsive. He and Cleopatra became lovers, and more than that, they became partners. Antony spent the winter in Alexandria, and they formed what they called the Inimitable Livers, a society dedicated to pleasure and luxury. But this was also a political alliance. Cleopatra gave Antony money and resources for his wars. Antony gave Cleopatra back territories that Rome had taken from Egypt. They had twins together, a boy and a girl, whom they named Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon. And later, another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. But in Rome, Octavian was slowly, methodically consolidating power. He portrayed Antony as a Roman general seduced and corrupted by an Oriental queen, abandoning Roman values for Egyptian decadence. He spread propaganda that Antony planned to move the capital of the Roman world to Alexandria, that he was under Cleopatra's spell. In 32 BCE, the Senate, controlled by Octavian, declared war not on Mark Antony, but on Cleopatra. It was a brilliant move. Octavian wasn't attacking a fellow Roman. He was defending Rome against a foreign queen. Antony and Cleopatra gathered their forces in Greece. They had a large fleet and substantial armies. But Octavian had a brilliant admiral, Agrippa, and morale in Antony's forces was uncertain. Many of his Roman officers didn't trust Cleopatra and resented her presence. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the fleets met at Atum, off the coast of Greece. The battle was desperate and confused. At a crucial moment, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships broke from the battle and sailed away. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his own fleet and followed her. His remaining ships and soldiers, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. Why did they flee? Some sources say they were trying to break through to escape with the treasury. Others claim Cleopatra panicked. We will never know the truth. But the result was clear. Octavian had won. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and prepared for the inevitable. Octavian pursued them. In the summer of 30 BCE, his armies arrived at Egypt's borders. Antony's remaining forces defected or melted away. The end was coming. Antony fell on his sword, the traditional death of a Roman general who had lost everything. But he botched it. The wound was not immediately fatal. He was carried to Cleopatra, who had barricaded herself in her mausoleum with her treasure, and he died in her arms. Cleopatra was now alone. Octavian wanted to take her back to Rome, to parade her in his triumph, to humiliate Egypt's queen before cheering Roman crowds. But Cleopatra was determined to die as a queen of Egypt, not a captive in a Roman spectacle. On August 12th, 30 BCE, Cleopatra dressed herself in royal regalia. According to legend, she had a servant smuggle in a poisonous asp, a snake sacred to the Egyptian sun god. She held the serpent to her breast and let it bite her. She died quickly, lying on a golden couch, dressed as a pharaoh. When Octavian's men found her, she was already dead, with 2 of her faithful servants dead beside her. Octavian was reportedly angry that she had robbed him of his prize, but also, perhaps, grudgingly respectful. He allowed her to be buried beside Mark Antony, in a tomb whose location is now lost, somewhere beneath Alexandria. Caesar Ion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was hunted down and murdered. Octavian could not allow a potential rival to live. But Cleopatra's children with Antony were spared and raised in Rome by Antony's Roman widow. Egypt became a province of Rome. Not a normal province, it was the personal property of Octavian, who would soon become Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor. No senator could even visit Egypt without the emperor's permission. Egypt's grain fed Rome. Egypt's wealth financed the empire. But Egypt was no longer independent. 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization had ended. The last pharaoh was dead. The temples would continue to function for a few more centuries, but they were increasingly empty. The old religion was fading. Greek and Roman culture dominated the cities. And eventually, Christianity would come, transforming Egypt yet again. But the monuments remained. The pyramids stood eternal in the desert. The temples of Karnak and Luxor still echoed with ancient prayers. The mummies of the pharaohs rested in their hidden places, waiting for the archaeologists who would find them thousands of years later. Ancient Egypt was gone, but it was not forgotten. Its mysteries, its achievements, its stories would captivate the world forever. From the waters of Nun to the death of Cleopatra, from the first stone of Dos's pyramid to the last breath of the last pharaoh, Egypt had endured for longer than we can truly comprehend. And now, as we reach the end of our journey, as the last pharaoh lies at rest and the sun sets on ancient Egypt, you can rest too. Let the eternal Nile flow through your dreams. Let the stars that guided the pyramid builders guide you into peaceful sleep. Let the wisdom of the ages settle over you like the soft sand of the desert. Egypt sleeps, and so can you. Good night.